in Ukraine. Before introducing the panelists, I'd just like to introduce the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, since we're a fairly new institution and some of you may not know us. We are based in Washington, DC, and we are dedicated to trying to change the mindset of the US establishment to focus on diplomacy and sustainable peace rather than the pursuit of US primacy by military means, and to emphasize the interests of ordinary American and Western citizens as a preeminent factor in the shaping of foreign policy. So I hope you will attend our more meetings in future, and also read our website, where we have at present a policy brief on the war in Ukraine. So on our panel today, we have three exceptionally distinguished speakers. I'll introduce them very briefly to save time because we have so much to cover. Ambassador Tom Pickering has held some of the highest positions in the State Department, including the positions of ambassador to Russia and to the United Nations. Gabriel Rifkind is head of Oxford Process, a leading British and international conflict resolution organization with extremely wide experience in conflict mediation, especially in the Middle East. And Sam Sharup, who served previously on the policy planning staff of the State Department, is now senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation and lead author of a report last year on attempts at compromise and coexistence with Russia. So I thought I would begin. Sam has to leave early, so I'll begin with him. First, I will ask the participants to give their general views of the situation from their own perspectives. Then we will have a discussion, and then I will throw it open to questions from the audience. Please send your questions through Q&A. I apologize in advance if, of course, I can't get to all of them, but this is an exceptionally large audience. So, Sam, perhaps you could begin by giving your views of the present situation in Ukraine, where we stand both in military terms and in the peace process, which is now ongoing between Russia and Ukraine.
Right. Well, thanks for having me, Anatole. And maybe I'll just start a little bit with the where the negotiations stand, particularly because there's been so much news today on it. Since at the almost the within a week of the conflict beginning, the first bilateral Russia-Ukraine context, which started in person in Belarus, and then have both proceeded in person and in online form since then. There have been a number of pieces of information that have leaked out, essentially, about what exactly the subject of the negotiations are. Clearly, the Ukrainians came in seeking an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal of Russian forces back to their pre-February 24th positions, and Russia was not going to agree to that. And the demands that Russia put on the table were, first, Ukraine giving up its NATO aspirations and adopting neutrality. Second, that the Russian language become a second state language. That third, that Ukraine recognize Crimea as part of Russia, which was annexed, of course, in 2014. Fourth, that Ukraine recognized the so-called independence of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics within their full regional boundaries. And I should remind our listeners that even to this present day, Russian forces do not control the entirety of either region. And before the conflict began, they controlled significantly less than half of the territory of those two regions. Fifth, denazification, in air quotes here, which has always been a sort of talking point more than a concrete demand, as far as I'm concerned. And sixth was the quote unquote demilitarization of Ukraine. And not on that list, but from what we've been led to understand, they've also, the Russians, put sanctions relief on the table as one of their conditions. So that's quite a long list. And I think we've seen, though, that on the first and perhaps the most important issue, that is the neutrality, that from almost the first day of the war, even the day before the war, President Zelenskyy has essentially, at least in theory, agreed to it. And there have been, as we have heard today, some substantive Ukrainian proposals put forward on what that might mean in practice. And it seems like that issue is probably the most, the one where there is the positions of the parties are closest. That is, Ukraine has accepted this, at least putting up to a referendum, the idea that that they would change their constitution to remove their NATO aspirations and to accept permanent neutrality in return for receiving security guarantees. And the details of that we learned a little bit more about today from the Ukrainians at their press conference in Istanbul, but would essentially involve the entirety of the P5 and Turkey and Germany. I might be forgetting one or another country there, but those are the core actors, committing to essentially come to Ukraine's assistance in a much more substantive way than with the Budapest Memorandum if this were to happen again. We don't, Russia sort of took the proposals today on that issue at least, and has said they needed to go back to capitals to study them further, but there is a sort of proposal on the table. And frankly, the other ones, a number of other items on that list, essentially, I would say are probably going to fall away or be addressed with some non-hugely significant concession. For example, on Russian language, although Zelenskyy has rejected the call to make it a second state language, he's agreed to consider some status for Russian along with the status of all of the titular languages of Ukraine's neighbors, and that he raised that in an interview over the weekend as one potential solution for that issue. The two issues that seem, and if there, sorry, one more issue, I would say maybe the three issues that seem most problematic going forward on that list are the territorial control and legal borders questions. In other words, Russia's insistence on essentially their separatist proxies controlling the entirety of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, that Ukraine recognized them as independent, and that Ukraine recognized Crimea as part of Russia. No Ukrainian government, I think, would ever be able to do that and survive. And this government shows no indication of being willing to do so. And frankly, Russia hasn't even won the territorial control piece on the battlefield yet. So although, one would imagine that with time that might become, I mean, they are making gains in the Donbas, and we can get into the military situation, but there's enough to talk about on the diplomatic front, I think, for me to use up my time. So with that, what I would say is that those, the third issue that is going to be problematic is the demilitarization one, although there, Ukraine has already made some concessions in the context of their offer on permanent neutrality, not to host foreign bases and only to host exercises with the consent of the guarantors. But in terms of limits on Ukraine's own military, Zelenskyy has rejected that, at least rhetorically, and it's unclear where we'll end up in that on that issue. All that having been said, so we have these two, arguably where the issues have narrowed a bit, and there has been some, at least substantive discussion of the core potential pieces of an agreement. But these two issues of territorial control and borders remain as where it's hard to see the Russian and Ukrainian positions converging. So what happened today was the Ukrainians presented their sort of more articulated offer written on the neutrality and security guarantees issue. And Russia made what it's called two concessions, one military and one political, The military one being that they've committed to reducing the intensity of their attacks on Kiev and Chernihiv, which is sort of the northwestern, as opposed to due north axis of advance, and that this agreement could potentially be signed by at the presidential level if it were to be concluded, which has been a Ukrainian demand, but Russia has resisted. On the military quote-unquote concession, it's to a certain extent a broader acceptance of the reality that taking the capital is really not a plausible military objective for Russia at this point. It would just require essentially a full-blown mobilization, and to what end is not particularly clear. So that does indicate that even Russia itself is leaning towards a negotiated solution as opposed to regime change as their outcome here. So the question is how you overcome these differences on territorial control and borders. I think that's a big question mark going forward. One of the possibilities is to basically compel Russia to soften those demands would be to put at least partial sanctions relief on the table if the Ukrainians would be interested in seeing the US and the EU do so, and the Russians were to relent on that issue and return to their February 23rd, 2022 positions, and which would involve, at this point, significant territorial retreat. So it's unclear that we'll get there, but it's hard for me to see leverage other than sanctions relief that might get us there eventually. So with that.
Thank you, Sam. An excellent overview of the situation. Ambassador Pickering, perhaps you could say something about America's role in the war and in the peace process, and whether there are opportunities for America to play a positive role, and what are the risks of America actually contributing to keeping the war going?
Thank you very much, Anatol, and I agree with you that I thought Sam's presentation was very broad and very helpful. Let me build on that and talk first about the U.S. role. The U.S. role obviously has been seen by many as one of the most important, and I think the U.S. sees it that way. It's a role that on the one hand is based on balancing between not becoming so involved, particularly on Ukrainian territory, that it runs the risk either through a no-fly zone or troop presence in Ukraine of opening up the boundaries of the war to involve NATO, and perhaps as a result of that, by accident, miscalculation, or by calculation, some set of elements of combat that would lead to a nuclear exchange, and the uncertainties that lie beyond that we saw in the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis or otherwise. And I think at the moment, the US has been very careful with that, undertook and got some criticism, particularly in terms of the domestic divisions, where traditionally the Republicans have been more hardline on these kinds of activities, and the Democrats have played catch up, perhaps not very successfully in some cases, perhaps too successfully in other cases. So there is that set of differences. The second part of the US involvement in the war itself has been obviously the supply side war, and it covers both the provision of military equipment and doing what it can to relieve the pressure on the Ukrainian government, whether it's through helping refugees or providing humanitarian assistance or relief. The third has been to unite NATO, and to do this in a very strong way, both around Ukraine and its battle, and secondly, but closely allied, around an effort toward a negotiated settlement. And while NATO has not been outspoken with respect to a negotiated settlement, and the US has, as a matter of deference, both said it's prepared to work closely with Ukraine and leave Ukraine the major decisions, many of which Sam cataloged very well, that have to do with the future of Ukraine in particular in the negotiated settlement. That set of activities has not moved forward to the point where we see any actual involvement of the United States at the negotiating table. One can only assume, and I think the assumption is a very well-founded one, that the US is in the closest possible contact with all of the players who are in one way or another relevant to it, and perhaps too with the Russians. It's hard to know, but it would be, in my view, a serious mistake if the US were not in one way or another communicating with the Russians on the kinds of things that it felt should happen and the kinds of things that it was prepared to support. But it is letting President Zelenskyy and his administration make the critical decisions on the future of Ukraine. I would just add finally, Anatol, that there is beyond Ukraine now a broad series of questions that clearly are, in the way in which this is unfolding, in the second rank in terms of consideration, but not necessarily in terms of their importance. And they range from the US-Russia dialogue on strategic stability and strategic weapons, through the question of what to do about intermediate range and other mid-range missiles as delivery vehicles, particularly for nuclear weapons, in terms of Europe as a region, and whether or not the INF treaties restrictions in some fashion or other could be imitated or repeated. And the third, and these are only arbitrary divisions, is the question of regional arms control on the conventional sense. And that perhaps touches most saliently and most pertinently some of the questions that Sam raised. How and in what way do you provide guarantees? Well, one of those is by actions. Another is by written documents. And we all know the latter have their own problems. And Mr. Putin has done his best to undermine almost any kind of commitment in one way or another in terms of its capacity to continue to exist. And Mr. Trump has shredded truth, and whether he'll be back again or not remains an open question, but it hovers over where we are. So that how and in what way third parties do become involved and actively involved is a very open question. But it doesn't mean that, in fact, we can see nicely compartmented, separately segmented sets of issues resolved without having an influence on each other. And it will perhaps take some time and some careful thought, and we might discuss that further, as to how the interrelationships might get best managed. Would there be separate groups, but some coordinating mechanism? Would that coordinating mechanism, particularly on the non-Russian side, be formal or informal? And would it have its foundation in some kind of an organization, OSCE, which includes Russia, or other organizations? Remains another open question. Not everybody belongs to every organization, and so it will be harder to fit. But I leave it there because we have a lot to discuss, and I want to have obviously an opportunity to hear from the other panelists, all of whom are friends and I admire, and particularly their work.
Thank you so much. Gabrielle, perhaps you could say something about how you see things at the moment from the perspective of wider peacemaking and the example of other such wars and processes. And perhaps in particular, I mean, are the territorial issues something that are just going to have to be kicked down the road, endlessly negotiated, like, other examples we've seen in recent history?
Yes. So thank you, Anatol, and the Quincy Institute for inviting me. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I only hope that you're being heard in the corridors of power. So I was going to talk from a conflict resolution perspective, and set the scene a bit about that to begin with, which is different from the practical implications and the way through. So, and I actually come from a psychological background. Conflict resolution is the voice of third party. It's supposed to be neutral. It's as if it doesn't take a position. And in fact, we can almost sound like the voice of appeasement, because the mood at the moment is such, in fact, unless you're taking a side, it's quite an uncomfortable place to take. But to resolve conflict, you have to get into the mind of all the parties, including the aggressor. And one of the problems at the moment is, in the face of Russian aggression, it's difficult to contemplate and even remember that there are underlying grievances with which peacemakers will need to engage. And one of the reasons that's so difficult is it looks like you're rewarding bad behavior. And Anatol, you talked about links. Syria is a very good example of this. And one of the reasons we got stuck in the quagmire of trying to make peace there is because the West identifies with certain value systems, whether it's freedom or democracy or liberal or the liberal order, which makes it very difficult to engage with parties who they consider to be authoritarian, brutal, and behaving in a way that they don't wish to engage. But the history of conflict, and I think Tom would agree with me on this probably, is that you have to talk to people you don't like. You have to talk, whether you're talking about the Taliban or Hamas or the Syrian regime, to resolve conflict. You have to engage with all the parties. And not only do you have to engage, you have to imagine how they're thinking, and you have to, what I say later is all sides, you have to write their victory speeches. You have to work out when Putin goes home to his people, can he say, of course, this was a victory. This was we had a month's war, and look what we've done for the people. And if he can't do this, it's more likely to be a protracted war. And what we need to be very vigilant about is we do not have the rubble of Aleppo. And there is a moment now where what could be done, there is possibly a window of opportunity, and it does depend how Western governments behave. We are actually, whether we're encouraging the Ukrainian government to escalate and to think it can win more, or whether we're trying to say that, the amount of suffering, because we do know in the end, nobody wins. And in terms of, we perhaps have an important international role in that. Henry Kissinger said recently, he said, I've seen 4 wars begin with great enthusiasm and public support, all of which we did not know how to end. And 3 of them we withdrew from internationally. The test of policy is how you end wars and not how you begin it. And so we should always be projecting to the end game and what that might look like. And I think we have to be a little vigilant about that, about our underlying motivations. I might say conscious or unconscious. President Biden said on his visit to Poland, he called Putin a butcher, and he said, for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. Now, there was strong rhetoric, but it was quickly played down by the White House. Now, my point here is one understands why people have emotions like this, and governments represent what the people feel. But to end conflict, one has to actually sort of take a position about how do you get to the end game? And how do we make some of the very difficult, fudgy compromises? In the end, it's not about winners or losers. Neither side will win. Initially, Russia was looking for capitulation and the unconditional surrender of Ukraine. But as the Russian aggression increased, the Ukrainian resistance grew. And as we know, there's been a very effective campaign led by the resistance movement. And the danger is if both sides believe they can still win, there will be an escalation around the table. And that gives the role of the international community. It's important that they are a moderating process to think about what would a protracted conflict look like, and what difficult compromises look like. To talk a bit about that, I mean, Sam gave a kind of very comprehensive outline, but we know that the area of neutrality, there are possibly ways round on that. And President Zelenskyy said, I'm not going to sacrifice my country's territorial integrity. So it requires a great deal of creativity in this area. And are there other examples where he can say to his people that I have not betrayed you, I have kept the integrity of this country, but somehow some kind of compromise that both sides can look to. And one can look to other examples of that. Germany, possibly, actually what happened after the Second World War, and how one can then say there was reintegration. Or I think, Anatole, you done some interesting examples on Finland and Scandinavia. There are examples of both where there have been compromises, and it's useful to throw those into the mix, because I think it's encouraging both to the mediators, because they can see that there were ways through and that there was a future afterwards. And the same question on territorial integrity is, can one give examples where it's worked and that countries have flourished and prospered after that? So I think I'll just end on the note of maybe we should all be writing victory speeches for all the sides.
Absolutely key to successful diplomacy. Okay, Sam, I'd like to begin with you. Am I right in thinking from what you said that you do not think there is any chance of resolving these territorial issues now through, as has been proposed, local referenda under international supervision? That's the first question. And the second one is, do you think that there is any possibility of beginning a diplomatic process? I'm not saying this would lead to anything, but whereby the Donetsk and Lugansk republics open negotiations on a confederal relationship, a common state with Ukraine, as has been proposed in certain other conflict resolution processes. What do you think, Sam?
So the challenge with both of these solutions is that they might have been plausible before this war, maybe, but it's pretty impossible for me to imagine that either would be politically viable after the amount of death and destruction that has been wrought, particularly in the previously Ukrainian government-controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. So, most of the population in that area, in those areas, have been displaced. I mean, Mariupol, for example, which is part of the Donetsk region, has been leveled, and the circumstances under which you would have a referendum and what even the questions you would ask, given those grim realities, are hard for me to imagine. I would also add that it would be an implicit undermining of Ukraine's constitutional authority to allow for referendums that are not that contemplate territorial sort of withdrawal from the Ukrainian state. There's not like a constitutional provision for that. I don't really see that as necessarily a way out of this. There might have been a case to be made that in the non-government controlled held areas that there was before the war that there was enough sort of organic at least anti-post-2014 Kiev sentiment that some sort of role for plebiscites and certainly local elections were envisioned by the Minsk agreements. But now I don't know, it doesn't seem pretty practical to me. On this question of a change in Ukraine's overall constitutional structure to reincorporate the two regions and there are multiple problems with that, as there were even with the Minsk formulas here, which would have, of course, granted the portions of those regions significantly enhanced constitutional rights. But it basically would create an asymmetrical confederation where Ukraine's other regions would have far fewer rights, and the only reason that these two regions would have them is because Russia had enforced that at the barrel of a gun. And it's also unclear to me whether that is something that Russia would accept at this point. So as a short-term solution or even a medium-term one, either of those poses, I think, more problems than it solves.
No, I mean, I wasn't suggesting, to be honest, that this common state solution would ever work. I was just thinking of ways in which, we could move from war to an endless diplomatic process.
Well, so if you want, and specifically vis-a-vis the Donbas on that issue, there are, I don't know that, even though it has been unfortunately voiced publicly at high levels in recent days, that is the Russian commitment to the basically the territorial expansion of their separatist proxy control. I don't necessarily see that. I mean, and it would be a climb down to give that up. But taking it will be militarily quite difficult, and will take time, over which Russia is likely to experience significant more economic challenges, and potentially even stricter sanctions. And so, it's not, if the other issue, the main issue of neutrality is addressed in some way that's acceptable to Russia, it doesn't seem, it would be a long shot, but it's at least something worth trying to see if they would at least, return to the sort of February 23rd, 2022 line of control. I don't see, I know that sort of Russia will be getting things on the other tracks, but on that track, it's hard for me to see where the you probably have to use leverage on other issues to get a concession there to make it work.
Thank you so much, Sam. I know you have to go soon, so I just want to say thank you very much for your participation and your contribution, which was really helpful. Ambassador Pickering, I want to ask, that President Biden's gaffe, if that it was, about basically about regime change in Russia. In your view, how strong is the pressure within the administration and in Washington to maintain full sanctions against Russia to bring about regime change, even if there is a peaceful, not a final solution, but a peace agreement to end this particular war?
Well, Anatole, I think it was an effusion of emotion at the time of the speech, much of it engendered by his own words and the reaction of the Warsaw crowd. It had, I think, significant capacity in the domestic environment in the United States, particularly those who are and consider themselves harder line than the president. The capacity of the United States to produce such a change is asymptotic to zero. And that the value of that particular statement should be turned right back on the Russian people and say, they're the people who must have the decision in their hands, and they're the people who can one way or another make that particular decision work, and that we would support what the Russian people have to say. I think it is a one-day story. I may be wrong, and will disappear because there are many other important things. If I could just spend a moment and comment on what Sam's answers were to your very important questions about what to do about the territories. It seems to me that it is hard, and I would not, by anything I have to say, in any sense wish to downgrade that. But we do know that as negotiations proceed, the hard often becomes feasible. And it becomes feasible because as the parties talk through the other alternatives, they are less feasible. And the negative efforts to put pressure on the other side don't diminish, but sometimes increase. Now, were those to take place, I'm not certain that, in fact, we couldn't find some way of having an answer. A referendum or a plebiscite, however, is a judgment about an accomplishment, not an accomplishment in itself. And we seem to be talking as if it were. Whereas, in effect, I think the really interesting question is, can the Poroshenko agreement in Minsk II, which lasted as a half-life of a very short period of time, to look at autonomy as an outcome, might or might not be revivable in one form or another, maybe in a negotiated form. Certainly not as a choice in a plebiscite, but the plebiscite might accept the outcome for the people, which would give it legitimacy. In general, I think Sam is right that what one could call is bifurcated systems in a common country, particularly in the democratic West, don't hold sway, but they are prevalent and they're part of the makeup of the Russian Federation, formerly in the Soviet Union and now with the so-called 22 republics with the oblasts. I was around when they negotiated Yeltsin and Shaimeyev about the future of Tatarstan. And at one point, as we will all recall, that became a sort of pseudo model for the future of Chechnya, which was subsumed essentially in the adoption of autocracy by Chechens at the full manipulation of Moscow, but on the pattern, more or less, of that. If that would help to solve the mayhem, I'm not sure it should be dismissed at the moment as non-feasible, even if it's extremely hard. But the combination of a negotiated outcome with autonomy as part of it would be, I think, useful to think about. There is also the territorial question on the military side. Russia has not advanced considerably yet. The Donbas and Lugansk Republic territories to move beyond the 1/3 roughly of those two oblasts, those two provinces that they controlled on February 23rd. Whether they'll be able to or not is part of the new strategy. It's part of so-called phase two. Phase two has a certain basically recently invented here quality to it to describe a situation in which phase one, seemingly with the broad objectives of taking as much or all of Ukraine as one could in a short space of time, has diminished from sight. Were the negotiations to go on, were the territorial issues to continue to be a disputed and difficult problem to resolve, would the Russians then choose to expand again their military activities, having perhaps with the sense of deep regret on anybody's part, perhaps except Putin, destroyed entirely all the available Ukrainian cities within artillery range? I don't know, but anything like that that remains unsettled in the negotiating process becomes once again a point of contention. And as long as there is military activity going on, that contention may well, in one way or another, seek to change the leverage on both sides. Those are very, very difficult problems to look at. Here, perhaps the US has got very little pressure leverage on Russia yet to go, but I think very importantly, the Russians are perhaps more susceptible to pressure on the oil and gas patch than anything else. But I do think we have to give very careful thought on the pressure leverage side to the issue of whether there is anything we can do about prices. Mr. Putin enjoys not just the benefits of invasion, such as they are, not at this point beautifully fulfilled, but the notion that the more he invades, the higher the price goes of oil and gas. And that is, in my view, a very backhanded way to, in fact, treat this problem without going after the question of the oil price. It can be changed, obviously, by very significant pumping, and there are Americans who believe that our environmental regulations are holding that back. And it may be that some give there will be necessary if particularly the effort to control and push down oil prices by increased use of oil and gas were followed in some international consortium by a short period to get the job done in Ukraine, followed by a longer commitment of the same kind of money to deal with renewables. That is, one would segue from one to the other. And President Biden hinted at that a bit in his speech without being totally specific, but I think opened the door to it. So there are innovative ways here that we might be thinking down the road of combining some of these factors.
Thank you. Gabrielle, several questions have related to possibly bringing Putin before the International Criminal Court. In your view, is this possible and is it desirable?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm better addressing the question of whether it's desirable because I'm not a lawyer. I think that's much more a legal question. I have concerns about this in terms of getting in the way of peacemaking. Because actually, if you're looking, even if one believes that he is a war criminal, and there might well be evidence for that, what you have to think about is how do you create the conditions for a peace deal? And I think one of the things with Putin is everybody talks about him as if they know him. And we want to believe that he's a completely isolated man with a very small coterie of KGB advisors around him, who sits at this very long table, possibly hasn't been vaccinated for COVID. And maybe all that's true, but at the same time, in Russia, he still has a significant support base, and his popularity has increased since the war. And some people describe him as it's a bit like he's this vessel and is this kind of faceless man for the psychic state of Russia post the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think with him, we have to be quite careful for what we wish for. It's entirely up to the people what they decide to do. But and I think Tom was quite clear that we're not thinking about regime change, but where we have in places like Iraq and when we're talking about Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, what we've actually seen is something worse in this place, and we've seen the rise of Islamic State. So I think one has to be careful what we wish for. And that sort of weaves around back to the International Criminal Court. And I'm always motivated. To me, the biggest human rights abuse is war. And therefore, what we have to think about is how do we end war? And what we have to think about is that Ukraine does not look like Syria 5 years on with the rubble of Aleppo.
Yes, I must say, from my own perspective as a former war correspondent, I find, some of the discussion of alleged war crimes in urban warfare to be somewhat unreal, because obviously defenders are going to dig themselves into residential areas. What else are they supposed to do if they're going to defend the cities? That is their duty. On the other hand, if the defenders do dig themselves into residential areas, then the attacking forces are going to bombard them. They have no choice. That is also their duty. Neither of these actions constitutes a war crime. Other things, of course, do, but I wouldn't go so far as as to say, obviously, that there are no crimes in war. Naturally, there are, but as you say, in any war, especially any war in the middle of a population, many terrible things are going to happen. The point is to stop the war. Sorry, just from my own, my own background and experience. Ambassador, we have several questions suggesting that Western leaderships are actually not doing nearly enough to promote peace. There's a marked lack of enthusiasm, perhaps masking a desire actually to continue the war. Do you think this is the case? And if so, what can we all be doing to try to push our governments into promoting peace?
No, I don't think that there is, although in a world of conspiracy theories where truth has become a kind of relevant, if I say so, a mechanism, it is very hard, obviously, to prove a negative. But I would say very, very clearly the US has no interest in a continued war, particularly given the fact that a continued war keeps open the door for the potential down the road for nuclear use, as I mentioned in the opening remarks section of this program. And I think that the US is very acutely aware of that, and is acutely aware that if it gets off the track and we end up destroying the globe, no continuation of the war is very useful. Any continuation of the war might be presumed on the basis that it was something that somehow or other we could do Mr. Putin in by doing so. And I suppose the President Biden's remarks about regime change didn't help to sell the point of view that I'm trying to express here. And it's obviously clear that one needs to admit the weaknesses of his own argument if you are expecting other people to have at least a sense that you're taking an objective view of the situation. But there is very little that I think we have to gain. And this war opened with a massive Russian offensive that appeared to be something that was going to succeed in a few days. And it was a miraculous circumstance that the Ukrainian opposition and their ability, courage, and bravery to fight the Russians, plus the disadvantages of the Russian military machine, as it seemed to be less and less effective, have changed the circumstances, and we're now talking about peace. Now, should we be talking about peace and doing so in a way that energizes it and perhaps takes over the lead? Well, the President Biden has been very, very tentative about that, believing that there is and must be a reasonable respect for the responsibilities of the Ukrainians for their own future and how they're prepared to move. Secondly, if I were judging this, I would judge that President Zelenskyy has leaned forward in this process rather than held back. One could see areas where either for bargaining purposes or for domestic political purposes, he might have been more restrained about some of the questions than otherwise. Accepting neutrality as an outcome, in my view, has to be defined in the context of, will I be allowed to defend myself as a neutral? And if so, how? And how does that fit into the circumstances? And one, I think, perhaps needs to give more time to that if you're a friend of President Zelenskyy. Not that you want to upset the process of finding peace, but you want to find something that has some durability, that has some plausibility, and that has some capacity over a period of time, particularly in a region which has now been made much more fraught by President Putin's action, to find a way to stabilize that in everybody's interest.
Can I ask an additional question there? Because, of course, the Ukrainians are asking very understandably for cast iron guarantees if they declare neutrality, that they will not be attacked, and that they've asked for guarantees that NATO will come to their defense. Now, of course, the irony of that is that NATO would not offer membership to Ukraine precisely because NATO did not want to come to Ukraine's defense. So, is this? I sometimes wonder, if Russia by any chance agreed to this, would this not be a major embarrassment to NATO to be asked to make this commitment, which they've never been willing to make?
I don't think so, and I wonder whether the Russians would, in one way or another, take that step anyway. It's like turning Article V into Arabic numeral 5. It in some ways is proposing the answer to the problem in the context of what you have just declined with respect to an ambition, at least early on, for NATO membership, because the principal value of NATO membership, particularly to small countries, is the ability to have an alliance to support you militarily were you to get into trouble in an aggressor invasion and to provide for your self-defense. So that possibility seems to be a little bit strange, and we'll have to see how and in what way it works it out. Guarantees are very difficult. The Iranians talked about guarantees to the Americans as indirectly through the Europeans in the NATO deal, and that's not yet settled. But we all know that, in fact, the positive assumptions that one had about respect for treaties and for observing treaties, even in conditions of change, has been quite large until recently, when, in fact, a whole bunch of treaties having to do with arms control between Russia and the United States were shredded. Not necessarily at the initiative of the Russians, but more primarily shredded at the initiative of the Americans, in ways that my view were clearly less than carefully thought out, less than realistic, and less than beneficial. But that's what governments do from time to time. The movement out of the JCPOA was perhaps even more heinous because the negotiators spent a long period of time providing no exit ramp out of the JCPOA. It was legally closed to the Iranians. And so we found ourselves caught in the legal trap and said, the hell with the law, the hell with international law, we're tearing up this particular issue. Well, what value do American guarantees have now against that, even for friends or enemies? And Mr. President Zelenskyy maybe should look back shortly at some of the US-Iranian history to see what he wants. Now, I think there are other ways with guarantees, because many of us pounded our heads against the wall when the Iranians came up with a very good situation. Actions speak louder than words, and actions built into an agreement which at least can provide a significant indication of an early step to ignore the guarantees are important. Secondly, monitoring, verification, and control were built into arms control agreements from the very beginning as a kind of action series of arrangements that help each side have confidence that what they were agreeing to was being carried out by the other side, and as a result, a guarantee and on any rational, reasonable basis for moving away. One could build in to the agreement, for example, say an Iranian agreement, the fact that if the Iranians got out of the agreement with no reasonable basis for having done so, that is, no violation by the other side, the group of states outside the agreement, but were still parties with the Iranians, would take certain sanctions actions against them. Or there would be, as we saw in the Iranian agreement, automatic sanction actions that came up as a result of Security Council action that the Iranians would pay a price for, were they to have done that. Well, can that be done? Well, the Russians are in the Security Council, highly unlikely to agree to anything through the Security Council that was snapped back against them in a way that obviously they were not prepared to accept, because they would pay a price for it. Those are the questions that are there, and I think are significant. The other question is, can you build into the agreement commitment to actions that one way or another will be of such interest to the parties that they will not risk walking out? Mr. Trump ignored those. I think irrationally he ignored those because we didn't want the Iranians to create a nuclear weapon, and we have now flirted for several years with that possibility by having done so. So those are the ways I think that we have to approach the question of guarantees with friends and with enemies in the negotiating process, and maybe very inventive people will think of some more ones.
I mean, perhaps in practice, the greatest guarantee will simply be that, you know, Russia has suffered so heavily in this war while failing to capture its key objectives, that the Russian government would be very unwilling to do this again, you know, given the casualties they've suffered and their lack of success.
I wish I could agree with you, but I think the Russian government's capacity, i.e. Mr. Putin's, to ask the Russian people to undertake extreme sacrifices in support of his policy objectives is unlimited by rationality.
You may be right.
I might respond to that, Tom.
Please.
Because I don't think Anatol is talking about rationality. I think this is something deeply emotional about what happens when you fail. and how far you take risks again, and how far you can take the people with you, and how far you can even tell a story that you can do it again. There must be some self-reflection eventually on that.
I think, you know, I'm inclined to think that you're right, Gabrielle, particularly in the impact that will have on the Russian people. The really interesting question is a Stalinist control system, which is now in place, sufficient to guard against popular revolution to displace Mr. Putin? Well, we saw, in fact, that for a long period of time, 70 years of communism, it did so. Now, Mr. Putin is not Mr. Gorbachev. And were Mr. Gorbachev to come along again after Mr. Putin, we might well have a time to do it. But I think under current circumstances, to hope, in fact, that the punishment that he's taken so far is sufficient in one way or another to get him, I think, to declare uncle on this, as opposed to now start a negotiation, is probably an overreach. But I would not deny the fact that a good bit of what has compelled him to the present steps, and after all, they've only been in place for 48 hours, so we don't know how long they will stay, is not in that sense something that is not having its effect, but it's having a very limited effect. And it's not having an effect that I think would radically turn him on his course and be willing to accept, quote, guarantees.
Thank you. Gabrielle, final question. Should reparations for war damage by Russia be an essential part of a peace settlement?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the answer, if you destroy something, you jolly well need to clean up your mess. However, will they do that? And what matters is that it's done in some, and that there is a rebuilding of Ukraine so that people have some sense of future, and we don't turn away and forget them. And, you know, Bosnia is an example of, we're given all kinds of promises to enter the EU, and then once outside the glare of the media, we somehow forget about these countries. So what matters is not what we just do now. And I think Biden did talk about how we have to regenerate and rebuild, and what we do post-conflict. All our focus is on now, and actually there will, unless we intervene to help in the transition to provide some kind of stability and security, we will see just endless cycles of conflict. So I think what matters is that it's done.
Here. And also that...
Let me just say that there's a difference between 1919 and 1945 with respect to Germany. And I think that the 1919 Versailles Treaty, with a very heavy load on Germany, had its own deleterious effects in the way German politics evolved in the 1930s in particular. In 1945, for both Japan and Germany and Italy, we undertook to do a lot of that and enabled the German government as a successor government to do it with respect to Germany. And the Marshall Plan, which was not, in a sense, so much a war reparations as an investment for the future, was an interesting way of handling all of that. That made a difference. And those lessons, I think, are important to remember and to think about. I think finally, the more we load burdens on the back of a peace process, the less likely we are to be able to solve those significant problems which will stand in the way of a peace process were we to introduce them as kind of sine qua nons at too early a basis in the discussion.
I entirely agree.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. So I'd like to thank you both so much for your really very interesting contributions. Thanks to everybody in the audience who came, and my apologies, you know, that obviously I couldn't get all your questions in. And to urge you to go to our website of the Quincy Institute and of our journal, Responsible Statecraft, and to read, we now have several reports and papers on the subject of this tragic conflict. So thank you all very much. And this was, for me at least, an extremely interesting discussion.